Hello and welcome to Varn Blog, and today I want to talk about recuperation. What it actually really means. I'm going to start us off with a Gramsci quote, one that I actually think is true. Ideas and opinions are not spontaneously born in each individual brain. They have had a center of formation or irradiation of dissemination of persuasion, a group of men, or a single individual even, which has developed them and presented them in the political form of the current reality. And another one from the prison notebooks as well. Common sense is a chaotic aggregate of desperate conceptions, and one can find there anything that one likes. Recently, an interlocutor of mine, an opposing friend, let's say, pushed on me that I didn't understand the virtue that was being hoarded by the PMC and why this was different, even though it was inter-elite, compared to BLM or the recuperation of the 70s and all the cultural norming of, say, different minority cultures, be they sexual or racial, in the US. Now, despite the fact that this was a Marxist using very conservative arguments about the cultural turn and cultural Marxism, that word was not used, although I happen to know said individual has read such things and knows where this comes from. There's a kernel of truth to that. But to think that the preparation of culture does one-to-one what people think, that's a different conclusion. If we look at the long march through the academy and then the long march through the entertainment industry of activists, and the focus on activism and entertainment still gets put upon today as people talk about Gamergate as somehow this floodgate that opened everything up for the things that would happen in the later aughts. You know, a cultural debate of which a market rebelled against someone using the markets in a different, more progressive way. But the movement from the factories into mediation has two clear and obvious effects. One, people are trying to prepare the culture so that they don't lose the next round. And to do that through operating in the cultural and superstructural, in quotation marks, sphere. To operate in the areas of cultural hegemony for creating a political subject or for tamping one down, a la Gramsci, or to operate in what Althusser calls the ideological state apparatuses. Now, I point this out because Gramsci and Althusser are opposed on many points, but on this, there is something true here. But there's another logic, a deeper logic that emerges. Why do you render all these things normal to the current situation? Why can conservatives not? And the very clear answer is expanding markets to smaller portions of society expands new markets, period. Markets, in this case, primarily for rents and advertising, but markets nonetheless. When something can't do that, it has very little power. You might go, okay, well then why Black Lives Matter and not the war in Gaza? Because wars, particularly wars over what amounts to a very slim piece of coastal land in a desert that is not even as big as a fifth of the average U.S. state, which is overpopulated and whose traditional occupations are being petit bourgeois merchants, fishermen, and olive farmers, is hard to turn into a viable market. And the Israelis have been very, very strategic in eliminating the Gazans' ability to be a workforce and thus be integrated into Israeli society. They have learned that itself from prior integrations, because people who work together have to know each other, and it's a lot hard to want to kill each other when you know each other in that way, even if you have different religions, even if you have different sexualities, etc. So lumpenizing a large part of the population is a way to make sure they are not included even as subordinated labor. If you ask yourself about the exterminationist turns in American politics on the indigenous versus the former slave, the former slave contributed labor even after no longer a slave, although often in slave conditions through various work codes, etc., whereas the indigenous was largely shut out. Their way of life deemed incompatible with economic modernity. Now, most of the genocide of the indigenous came from smallpox, but the Indian Wars were brutal, real, and genocidal, and very much based on people who were not allowed, not so much completely disallowed as in the Gazans, but not really allowed to maintain their way of life and also enter the workforce. So recuperation becomes impossible and exterminationism becomes more likely. This is a brutal reality, but one has to look at it. But let's go back to this cultural turn, the way PMC culture works. Now, I conceded that there are social categories, elites, managers, and academics that are economically and in terms of political economy, very precarious to categorize as something separate from the working class. Every time you do that, you actually do damage to the category of the working class. But they are social categories with discrete and understandable content. Usually, however, this is an attempt to render what is a sociological type into a political economic type. And this confuses things and makes things go on vibes. I talk about elites all the time, but I do that specifically because I'm not just talking about the bourgeoisie. When I'm talking about the bourgeoisie, it's easier just to say that. I don't confuse matters with things like PMC because this social category is actually more easily referred to as liberals, period. End of discussion, full stop. Because you will see people who engage in, quote, PMC culture who are not even college educated, particularly now after the internet. So in these battles for cultural hegemony, when there is no political economic opportunity available, it often goes to culture as a way to prepare the way for the next battle. But this actually, in and of itself, in capitalism, creates new markets and new rent-seeking opportunities. BLM leads to DEI. DEI is often a rent-seeking opportunity. If you don't see that, this is not to say that everyone involved in DEI is cynical. Rent-seeking opportunities work better when they're not cynical, when people actually believe them. And again, as Gramsci says, and this was another part of the quote, common sense is a chaotic aggregate of desperate conceptions, and one can find anything one likes there. This is the way we do with elites. All political discourse in the United States right now says that it's anti-elite, and yet all political discourse picks an elite, a counter-elite that's his ass and want to kiss. And most of these people, even if they don't admit it, are not interested in getting rid of elite discourse or getting rid of elites. A lot of them, even if they wear red and talk Marxian nonsense, don't believe that's possible. But then I ask, why are you wearing red and talking Marxian nonsense if you don't believe the goal is even a possibility? That's also a form of recuperation. Be wary of it. The political categories here our contestation in Gaza really messes up those categories. But let's also flip this around for a second. As I've said over and over again, this will be difficult to pivot into a larger left-wing movement. This is a very specific case of national liberation, of which trying to apply its concepts to other places are going to get really muddy really fast. Think about people talking about Colombia buying property in Harlem as a form of settler colonialism in an already capitalist society in an already gentrified New York. The average person, whether their aggregate of common sense is chaotic or not, has to deal with the fact that that's an extension of the metaphor that seems to be so extended that it breaks it. You can't use that in the same way. You can use the principles, maybe, the principles of equality, fraternity, and solidarity here, but we don't actually believe in those principles most of the time. At least not these activists. They haven't thought these clear. To them, this sounds liberal, even though it also underpins Marxism. Now, every one of those concepts has contradictions within them. Freedom for the rules is death for sheep. There's both equality and classlessness, but equality and utter deprivation. Solidarity can erase as much as it can stand out. There's always a tension between the universal and particular. No amount of hand-wringing will undo that. But look at what the cultural turn gave you. Yes, it affected society, but it led people to believe that the affection of society, which created new forms of elite, to be okay with radically liberated all gay people or black people or whatever category you want to talk about. And that's just not the case. That is a liberal movement. But a lot of the people who laid the groundwork for that liberal movement were trying to lay the groundwork for something more radical without realizing their place in the political economy. This is how recuperation fundamentally works. Furthermore, the language, the superficial language of the left with all its mediations and ideas can easily be co-opted to the right because a lot of this language is not thought through and not grounded in any really substantive political economy. And I'm going to go ahead and say it probably can't be. Okay? All political movements need propaganda. They need myths. They need mediations. They need visions. But those myths, mediations, visions, and propaganda do not all speak in one voice. But if you can't render them somewhat simple so people can repeat them, they don't serve their mimetic function. However, if you believe that, you're drinking your own Kool-Aid. And often, you'll be bamboozled by something else. Like and subscribe. Hit the bell. Have a great day.